Now we start to get into the real physiology. This will have a lot of overlap with the stuff we did before, but it's really fundamental to understanding the rest of the semester. So when you get confused, make sure you write down a question, prepare it so that I can answer it for you in the future, and get it to me in whatever way you choose. So we are going to do membrane potentials, but before we do that, I want to start building something with you that I built quickly before. I'm going to build slowly this time to make sure that you actually get it. So let's talk about the cell membrane and then what's in the intra and extracellular fluid. So this table that you're seeing right here, it's not something I expect you to memorize. I just want you to look at the concentration, relative concentrations of, for instance, sodium and potassium, and we know those are going to be really important. There's some other things as well. Amino acids, the intracellular fluid, the far more proteins in the intracellular fluid, far more chloride in the extracellular fluid. So what we're going to do is we're going to slowly build so that you guys understand how the cell membrane ends up having this type of charge, in which on the extracellular fluid, there's a slight excess of positive charges or cations, and in the intracellular fluid, there's a slight excess of negative charges or anions. But I want to build that. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to build it for you. Now I'm going to show you this figure, which is figure 710. This is pretty much doing exactly what I'm doing, but I'm going to do it slowly so that you guys can do it with me. If I were you, I would get out a piece of paper, a whole clean sheet of paper, and do this with me. Okay, so notes first. There's a cell membrane, of course, that lies between the intracellular fluid and the extracellular fluid. Because the cell membrane exists, it means that the ICF and the ECF can be different from one another. We know that it's selectively permeable. We have learned under what circumstances you can get ions and proteins and things like that across it. So where we need to start in building is understanding the ion composition of the intracellular fluid and the extracellular fluid. So let's start there. Let's start with a clean whiteboard. And we're going to draw a great big cell. I'll try to keep it neat. We all know I'm not very good at this digital whiteboard quite yet. It doesn't matter that it looks like a bean. It's a cell. And let's start with the concentrations of a few important ions in the ICF and a few important ions in the ECF. Okay, so you guys already kind of know part of this. You know that the ICF has a relatively high concentration of, potassium, okay, and relative to the ICF, the ECF has a relatively low concentration of potassium, okay, and the ratio that we're dealing with here is 30 inside to every 1 outside. Cool? Okay, and then what else you also know is that the ICF has a relatively low concentration of sodium, and the ECF has a relatively high concentration of sodium. And what we learned before was these ratios. It's about 15 outside to every 1 inside for sodium. And we also learned that maintaining these concentration gradients is homeostatic for the cell. And that means that not that this never changes, because it certainly will, but that when it changes, you need to put it back. It's like saying if your body temperature's ideal was 98.6, you know if you run outside it's going to change, but you have to put it back. So this is homeostatic. It's not unchanging, but it's homeostatic for the cell. But then I need to add a few more details. So let's look at your notes for just a second. Okay, so the other details that I didn't tell you guys before, just because you had enough to learn before, was if we look at the ICF, there are other things in there. In the intracellular fluid, an important player here will be that there are lots of proteins in the intracellular fluid. And these are big structural and functional proteins. Some of them make up the cytoskeleton, for instance. Some of them are enzymes. But there are a lot more proteins on the inside than there are on the outside. And proteins tend to have a net negative charge. Okay, so keep that in mind, and I'll draw it in just a second. And the other thing is in the ECF, in addition to the sodium and potassium that we talked about in the ECF, there is also a relatively high concentration of chloride ions, which are negatively charged. So let's add those things in. Okay, so let's add in some high concentration. Let's change the color. High concentration of proteins, and they're a net negative charge, and they're big and non-penetrating, meaning that you are not going to find them moving out accidentally, but they're negative, okay? And then in the extracellular fluid, in addition to the positives that we already know about, there is a high concentration of the chloride ion. Now, the important thing for you to understand is that you can imagine all of the positives and the negatives canceling one another out so that you could end up with a net neutral electric charge on the inside and the outside. Okay, so now, will these things move? Will sodium, potassium, chloride proteins move? Will they move? Like I said, with the proteins, they're trapped unless you move them on purpose by exocytosis or some type of transport. The ions can diffuse, of course. They can't diffuse straight through the cell membrane because they're charged and polar. But they can diffuse if you will give them a channel to diffuse through. So a gated channel or a leak channel. So that they won't diffuse directly through the lipid portion of the membrane. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this information that you have and I'm going to show you how the cell gets this net positive charge on the outside of the cell membrane and the net negative charge on the inside of the cell membrane. And that's going to be what we call resting membrane potential. So we're going to start from where we were last time, and then we are going to put in some channels. And then we're going to see how quickly things leak at first, and then establish a charge, and then assess how quickly things leak. So basically, we're going to start out neutral in the intracellular fluid, just sort of as an ideal so that you can see how you get a charge. So I want you to imagine that in the intracellular fluid, before we have established resting membrane potential, for every positive there's a negative, so it's a net neutral charge. And the same thing is true in the extracellular fluid. For every positive there's a negative charge. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to let them leak and see what happens. All right, so this is where we're starting right here. So I want you to imagine this is at time 0, let's say the birth of a cell, realizing that this is not exactly how it happens, but it allows you to conceptualize how you end up with a charge. So at time 0, which is where we are right now, I want you to imagine that the intracellular fluid has a net neutral charge, and the extracellular fluid has a net neutral charge. For every positive, there's a negative. And then what I want to do is I want to put in some channels for sodium and potassium. So let's put in a sodium channel, and let's put in a potassium channel. And so let's label them. This one's a potassium. It's a leak channel. I'm going to just write LC. And then a sodium leak channel, okay? And then I'm going to let sodium and potassium diffuse. So you already know the directions because we established this last time. So I want you to imagine again that the ICF and the ECF is net neutral. So there's no electrical gradient that is motivating the ions yet. Okay, so we know which direction things are going to go. The sodium is going to diffuse in down its concentration gradient. The potassium is going to diffuse out down its concentration gradient, but this is where we have to deal with the unequal concentration gradients of sodium and potassium. So right now, before we have a charge, which ion, sodium or potassium, those are the two big ones, is going to initially diffuse faster? Which one, sodium or potassium? What do you think? Before we have a charge to deal with on the cell membrane, which one is going to diffuse faster? Potassium is going to diffuse faster because its ratio is 30:1, whereas sodium's ratio is 15:1, and the ratio can determine the speed of flux. So potassium is going to initially diffuse faster. So I'm going to diffuse positives out faster than I diffuse positives in. And the net effect of doing that is that started out neutral, neutral. And what I'm going to do is I am going to accumulate positives on the outside of the cell membrane. I started out neutral, neutral, but I moved positives out faster than I moved positives in. And what I'm going to do with the inside is I'm not going to accumulate negatives, but I'm going to start to reveal these negatives that were already there. So the inside of the cell membrane, I'm going to start to reveal the negatives that were formerly sort of hidden by the positives. Okay, so what I've got here is I have accumulated a charge on either side of the cell membrane. And there where I am is this picture, right? So the extracellular fluid has a slight accumulation of positives. The intracellular fluid has slightly more negatives. And then what happens is they kind of attract to one another right around the cell membrane, like two magnets around a piece of paper. So after the initial leaking that occurs with those leak channels, the unequal leaking means that the cell membrane is going to become positive on the outside. It's going to become negative on the inside. And so now what we have is we have an electrical gradient, an electrical charge on the cell membrane. So this is all happening to the cell membrane when it is at rest. So all of this is just basically baseline for the cell membrane. And when it gets here, it needs to keep it there. So what I have established here in this picture, again, is what is homeostatic for a cell. This is homeostatic for a cell, this is homeostatic for a cell, and now I can tell you that this charge is homeostatic for a cell. This is called resting membrane potential. Question for you. How do you think I'm going to stay here? How am I going to maintain this resting membrane potential? I am going to need to maintain those concentration gradients of sodium and potassium, because if I don't maintain the concentration gradients, I won't maintain the charge gradient. So what could I use to maintain these? I could use the sodium-potassium pump, our friend. The sodium-potassium pump could help me maintain this pretty much indefinitely. And I can continue to pump sodium out, potassium in, and use ATP for the pump. Okay, so this is at resting membrane potential, and this is what the cell is doing just by default. It's really, really working hard for something that's supposed to be at rest. So at rest, after the establishment of the resting membrane potential, I get this positive-negative nature. And when I get here, I say that the cell has achieved steady state or resting membrane potential. And ions are now going to move for two reasons. Now they are going to move not only because of their electrical gradients, but they are also going to move because of their, I'm sorry, not only because of their concentration gradients, they're going to also move because of their electrical gradients. So hopefully you can see with this picture, any positive ion is now attracted to the inside of the cell. Any negative ion is now attracted to the outside of the cell. And now what's happening is this electrical gradient will impact how quickly the ions move. So last tidbit is to show you this image from your textbook, in which they kind of do the same thing. This isn't the kind of image you want to look at projected, but it's figure 710. It's the kind of thing you want to look at closely while staring at the textbook. So what it starts out with is no charge at all, just concentration gradients. Okay, then it sticks in the channels, which is exactly what I did. Then it lets them move, right? They don't move at equal rates. And then what happens is you accumulate a charge, and I'll deal with the number in just a second. So, and then let me show you an animation that shows you the same thing. And resting membrane potential. Okay, so I'm going to make this one full screen and hopefully as loud as I can get it. Okay, let's see if you guys can hear this really well. Oops. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to make it play loud for you guys. Okay, let's do this. Not playing. Okay, I'll play this separately.